All right, I'll keep an eye out on the waiting room here. Let's see, why don't I go ahead and introduce you, Enith? And I'll introduce David as well and just ask him to say hello. Our presenter today is Enith Williams. She is the founder and executive director of the Reparations Finance Lab and also the Center for Reparations Finance and Practice. And she'll say a bit more about those, I'm sure. We ask a fellow Francisco Collaborative member to respond to her comments, and that will be David Harley, who is the co-founder and CEO of Third Way Capital based in Toronto. All right. Well, I will step out of the way here. Enith, I'll also pull up the presentation, so you'll have that handy here. I'll go into sharing mode, if that sounds okay.
Sounds good.
All right. Okay. And there we are. Now let me put this in a better view, which would be the AI mode. There we go.
Oh, look at that.
Okay. There we go.
Okay.
Is that all right? Great. Okay. All right. Enith, please go ahead.
Well, hello, everyone. And it is wonderful to see so many of you. Thank you for coming. And special thanks to lots of old friends, including Margot, who I worked with 20 years ago, 15 years ago, on the board of the Van Cortlandt Park Conservancy. So it's amazing how this community pulls everyone together. So I'm just so grateful to see everyone. And so I guess before I begin, David, I don't know if you want to say anything, and then I'll just go into the presentation, maybe just, and then we'll have a conversation on the other side.
Just to say, I've had the opportunity to look at, it's called a draft version of the paper, and I've been so impressed, intrigued by what Enith has put together here. She's going to attempt to condense this into half an hour, which is very hard to do. And I will attempt to respond to some pretty weighty thinking around this. So yeah, just hang on to your hats there. I think it'll move quite quickly, but obviously as a community, I'm sure Enith will make herself available after the facts, and you can engage in different ways.
Okay. Thank you. Great. So I will start with a standard disclaimer, but in this case, it's really important when you are, I think, when you're wrestling with weighty theological matters, and certainly with language from the Holy Father. So these views are mine and mine alone. And they stem from a deep appreciation for, and I was speaking with Elias before we came on, about what does it mean to contend with memory, and what does it mean as humans to constantly strive to be better than we were and to move the human project forward. And it is in that realm that I actually founded the Reparations Finance Lab, which I began after the George Floyd murders. And as you will all recall, the global sort of just outrage, but also how that was centered in corporate
go to the Indian place that
communities where there was so much conversation and angst and anguish and contending with what was the role of corporates in the racialized harm of Black folks that ended with the murder of George. And we started to see a lot of commitments from corporates to direct their investments and their capital towards racial repair. And coming from that background, I thought, how do we evidence hold accountable and really measure the change in the lived experience of Black folks that was really behind those commitments. And I thought, both hopefully, but also slightly cynically, that the moment would pass and we would have essentially had a a moment and then we would move on, but the harm for Black people would continue unabated and unaddressed. And so I thought what was necessary was for capital to come in at the scale of the harm, which we will see is measured in trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars. And as evidenced and spoken about in the encyclical, has been 6 centuries in the making of a racialized economic reality for people of African descent. And so this conversation and this presentation is beginning to ask us to, as people of faith, and I know that not everyone on the call may be a person of faith, and certainly maybe not Catholic, but as people of faith, how do we reckon with what Pope Leo has put forth in his first, and usually, you know, from what I know from church sort of practice, the first encyclical of a new pope is often seen as indicative of how he thinks about the role and how he means to position the church in which he sits going forward. So I thought it was really, really meaningful that he addressed 2 issues that I myself have been contending with in the Reparations Finance Lab, the role of AI, as well as the role of the transatlantic trade in enslaved people. And so how amazing is it to find that you are looking at issues that the Pope himself is opining on. So with that said, let's go into the presentation. It's called Investing with Memory. And you know, when you put these things, you try to think about what can I say to make it more meaningful and sort of enable engagement. And so it says a new model for reparative finance in the Catholic tradition. But I think the sort of the line about faith, finance, and the work of repair is the piece that resonates the most. Where does faith sit? Where does finance sit? And what is the work of repair within that framework? And I come to this, David asked me, you know, and he'll get to it, you know, what is your faith background? And I said, well, I converted to Catholicism as an adult, but I am in it, which means I have, you know, nuance in my views. And I also even spent a few semesters in seminary just thinking about some of those issues. So I do come to this conversation from a faith practice going all the way back to my childhood. And I've really contended with what is it that faith has asked me as a person to do? And in my professional practice, how do I embody that in whatever area and arena that I've worked in? So next slide, please. So we note the most important part of the encyclical is that there is an apology and that we are asked to remember, and then we are asked for me to consider the cost of repair. Next slide. So what does Magnificat Humanitas ask us to do? To me, the most important part of it is that the Pope apologizes for the Holy Saints' role in legitimizing slavery and for the centuries of delay in condemning it. He names it a wound in Christian memory. And I think whether or not you're faithful, the fact that the leader of a tradition can say, we have created a wound in the memory of our practice is important. And I also think what then comes after that apology and that acknowledgement. And for me, the reparative sequence requires that Catholic capital, but all capital, must move from apology to memory and from memory to action. Because in my frame, apology without memory is sentimental, oh, I'm sorry. Memory without systemic analysis becomes ritualized, and an active investment framework builds confession directly into an investment policy, what I call and term a ledger of repair. Next, please. So just a little history review. In the 15th century, we saw a series of papal bulls that essentially authorized conquest and enslavement, which really what it resulted in was that it legitimized dominance into law and all of the early commerce of the New World. And those papal bulls were really, really important because they explicitly authorized the subjugation, enslavement, displacement of those who are not Christian. And the fact that Pope Leo has forcefully contended with that and apologized is really an important framing. So, and those bulls set the frame for the 17th to the 19th century with all of what we read about in history, in both world history and economic history, the sovereign charters, the plantation economy, that were basically focused on doing one thing, which was to build massive wealth in Western empire, right? They resulted in capital market instruments. One of the first papers I wrote was the way and the role of enslavement in building the global capital markets and the instruments and tools that we used in insurance, contracts that were written on the bodies of the enslaved, et cetera, et cetera. That continued all throughout the 17th and 19th century, over 260 years in the US of chattel slavery. Then we get to the 20th century, we begin to have, formal decolonization. And I am from a former colony. I was born in Jamaica, and in sort of growing up, you knew that we had a past and a legacy that was tied to empire. What we did not appreciate and understand was how deep that legacy was in how our society would function and perform after independence. And so now today, we have those centuries of old disparities that are just so rigid. There's an exercise I engaged in earlier, which was, why does capital always flow in those sort of same lines out for one into another? And it's because it's like a river, right? It goes in one place, it gets very comfortable, it knows the terrain, it structures, and even if there's a flood or a drought, it kind of ends up back in the same path, and capital is like that. So we need to understand and contend with this to understand that what we see today, that's evidenced in the racial wealth and well-being gap, is not because of what has happened today. It goes back in the modern world, in the modern era, all the way to the 15th century, and what those papal bulls and other enabling infrastructure set in place. Next, please. Yes, it has been damned. Yes. So I find it interesting, and those of us who think too much, you kind of think, are there patterns? So here's Pope Leo, and he is, to me, echoing and following a thread that was established by the other Pope Leo, right, the 13th, where he speaks about Catholic social teaching. And, I did my quick review of Catholic social teaching, thanks AI, a little primer. But, it's important. We learned this. I learned this in formation. What does it mean for Catholic social teaching? And the takeaway I had then was what it called on me to do as someone who wanted to practice the faith, how I must be with others. But there's also the bigger picture as I come into a space where I started to use capital and be responsible and historic for capital, which was the role of that capital. And as laid out in Catholic social teaching and capital, there's some key principles, the common good, right? And I distill it down into, how do we know that portfolios are faithful? And for me, what that means is that they're faithful if their returns, what we make on those returns, help close the wounds, help close the gaps in wealth and land owning and other economic practices, rather than deepen them. So we must contend with, how does accumulation now function within systemic injustice? And does that compromise us in the moral alignment of our capital? This other subsidiarity, which is so important, as I worked for a while in national government, and part of what you do when you do national planning is there's a tendency to have your elected officials and your policy your policy stewards who sort of, make decisions on behalf of communities. But subsidiarity tells us that we must have the decisions sit with and be managed by and really have full participation of the harmed community. And we'll go in later in how does that actually, what are the implications of that for the capital that we steward and for our portfolios? And the one that really sits and that I think we can't get away from, and especially in this time of just, we speak of the extreme in wealth inequality, and also just the cries of the poor who are being turned away at our borders, all of that is the preferential option for the poor, right? It requires fundamentally that we structurally redirect capital towards the well-being of the poor, that we center them in our decision-making. And so, we think about those of us who are capital allocators, we're minded and we're duty-bound for those who are licensed to practice fiduciary duty, right? But for me, with the option for the poor, the question that has arisen and that I think we need to think about, when we practice fiduciary duty and we steward capital, on whose behalf do we steward that capital? Is it on behalf of the capital holders, or is it on behalf of the world that we want to see flourish, on behalf of the poor and on behalf of nature? And that is a conversation we can get into later. Thanks. Someone give me a time check, Liz. I can go. Next one, please. So the framework that I've developed and I've been working on for the last year and a half, certainly for those who were at the Francesca Collaborative Conference in last November here in Washington, D.C., Investing with Memories, the framework that I've really settled on to explain what it is that Reparations Finance Lab is trying to do and what is it, how are we looking at the work that we have taken on to ourselves, what is the message? And so investing with memory means carrying accountability, care, and stewardship for the future into capital allocation so that money answers to repair as well as return. And I take some of that framework from the lesson I learned in impact investing, ESG, but it is that repair is centered. It is a reparative framework and not just one around return, whether that be social return or social capital, but really repair of the harm from the legacy of the trafficking of enslaved people and the extraction of value from their bodies and colonialism from the nations from which they come. So we want investing with memory to be a diagnostic of how we interrogate capital. Next, please. And so now I want to show just a little bit of data to kind of make clear why this framework is so important. At the lab, it's called a lab for a purpose, which when I was designing, I was like, what are you going to do? You're upset about George Floyd and, you're not a researcher, you're not an academic, so you can't write a book or a paper. You're not an activist. I'd like to say, been there, done that. What are you going to do? And I thought, well, what are the lessons I learned in finance when I worked in banking? And so much of our work is around just building data and evidence for the investment decisions that we would make. And I thought one of the ways that I wanted to sort of contextualize and center the lab and the work I do was that it would be based on the data and the evidencing of the harm and the historical harm, so that as I would enter into conversations with capital allocators, asset owners, I would be able to say to them, this is not just sentiment. This is not a following on of your feelings, however they were around George Floyd, but there's a historical debt. And this is what that look, this is where that came from. This is how it's evidence in the present. And now this is what you need to do and to move capital to repair. Next, please. So with that framing, I thought about when I entered this work, oh my gosh, this is 2026. So that was 21, 22. And the dominant frameworks that I encountered with ways that capital was moving outside of traditional banking terms, because I work with a mainstream bank, and impact and capital that sought to align with value was with ESG.
Keep me
And
informed.
so the interrogation was, what were the limitations with ESG that I thought I saw, or with impact investing, or with racial inequity, and why were those not sufficient to what I was building as a theory of concern and a theory of change that has now become a theory of practice. And I thought with ESG, very, very important, because it actually introduced into the framework of capital and asset owners and allocators that there ought to be a consideration beyond return, right? So this framework of environmental, social, and governance as part of how we think about how capital interacts is critical. It shifted the industry, it shifted capital flows. But my concern was there was no real memory of the racialized harm. It sort of was like, well, this is what we have. This is how we have to, this is how we look at the environmental impact, the social, the governance. But for someone who was coming to this conversation really, really motivated by understanding and centering racialized harm, it fell short. Same with impact investing, focuses on the returns of capital into the future, but not at all contending with what I was thinking about racialized harm. Same with racial equity, very, very important. That lens really grew and was magnified during those protests around what is racial equity. But again, we focus then on just observable metrics. How many people are employed, who's on the board, but not with that history. And so the reparative investing for me sought to answer those questions, right? And it explicitly centers historical accountability, but even more importantly, or as importantly, structurally, it seeks to restructure governance, ownership, and capital distribution at the center of how capital moves into those communities that have this historic harm embedded in them. Okay, next one. So when we speak of investing with memory and we speak about, the legacy of those papal bulls, when we evaluate how is that showing up today, and we're using those, capital measures. And so from the first papal bull to today, there's a group called the Battler Group, which they're insurance quantifiers. Their main business is looking at loss and claims for insurance companies. And they were commissioned by a leading reparationist in the classic sense of reparations, which is a CARICOM group that's seeking to engage with, in this case, King Charles now, first it was the Queen, in reparations for the Caribbean nations that were colonized and the people who were enslaved. And Professor Robinson, who is one of the commissioners and an advisor to CARICOM, actually commissioned the Battler Group to say, can you help us to quantify the harm from the transatlantic slave trade? And the number that they came up with, and the methodology, it's a wonderful paper. I think we have a link in our deck to that. Came up with a global reparative liability of between 100 to 131 trillion dollars. That number is so large as to be almost incomprehensible, right? But the breakdown is important. So there's 77 to 108 trillion for the harms during the period of chattel slavery. That includes everything from loss of life, wealth extracted that went in one direction to build empire, etc. Say $70 trillion of that. But even after emancipation, which we celebrate and think about and say, well, that was, that was then, we're now over, we can move forward. The harm continued, and they quantified it at $23 trillion. Right? And this particular bit of it is what's really, really important, is if you break it down into the humans who were trafficked and exploited, the numbers are staggering. 19 million people harmed across the centuries, which works out to roughly 802 million extracted years of life. And we can sit with that for a moment. 19 million people over 4 centuries that were harmed in various ways. All of the harms of enslavement, the harms of colonialism, and then the post emancipation harm that continues. And as I said before, that now manifests itself in the wealth gap, the well-being gap, all of the harms that we can sort of, look through and elucidate. That's the ledger. That is what the papal bull set in train. And so when the Holy Father apologizes in the name of the church and calls that succession of both declaration, but also the inability to clearly and forcefully issue an apology and then set in train the work of repair, this is what that looks like. Next slide, please. And so another way to look at this is, what is the wealth divide globally? And I think many of us, certainly through the George Floyd conversation and ongoing conversation, and maybe even more now, we are aware of the racial wealth gap in the US, where the average US family individual has wealth of $550,000. And the mean for Black families is somewhere like $24,000, so significant divide. But look at Britain, which, certainly from where I come from, a real important reference point, it's $302,000. And then we look at the former colonies. Now, Barbados in the Caribbean is heralded as one of the wealthiest Caribbean nations, but 90,000 compared to 300,000. Jamaica, country of my birth, 24,000. And look at Ghana, $6,000, with the same historical interaction happening, right? So the encounter between Europe and the continent of Africa, which resulted in today's legacy of enslavement and colonialism. Now we have this present day wealth divide, and we can only acknowledge that it came from those activities. Next, please. And so I put this in because I wanted to demonstrate for those of us in America how this harm continues even to today. So we're having a conversation in the US around DEI and anti-DEI and reverse discrimination, and how and why we need to have a preferential option, if one wants to say, for African Americans who have just been so left out of economic activity. And there's this wonderful group called the ANGS research group that just does research that's focused entirely on Black community. And, they show through their research that despite Black Americans constituting 13% of the population, right, their Black enterprise, their activity is in the federal contracting pool. And it's important that we look at the federal government, because one of the things we can discuss and think about is the way in which the federal government has been used to distribute resources to communities. 13% of the population, only 1.2% of that has gone to Black-owned enterprises and communities. And yet we still have a conversation about DEI, right? And about set-asides or preferences, right? Other minorities get 10%. And despite the white population being 60% in the United States, they get 88% of all the federal contracts that are out there. And as I said before, we know that the federal government has been the seat of distributing wealth in America. Everything from the Homestead Act, which distributed more than 2 million acres to incoming immigrants from Europe after emancipation, to the New Deal that was established, for example, not many may know, but when Social Security was established, it explicitly did not cover those categories of employment that Black folks, domestic work, and so weren't covered. That's a way of extracting wealth. To redlining, which was a way when the federal government was underwriting mortgages and enabling, workers to acquire homes. They essentially created a formula that excluded Black home ownership. That was the federal government taking that risk and ensuring that that there was not equal distribution. There's a case right now, I think it's maybe not a good time, against the Department of Defense for Black veterans who fought in the wars, all of the wars, but certainly this is focused on World War II, who came back to America and were not privy and did not benefit from the GI Bill. So here's the federal government as a provider of wealth and explicit policy that denied Black communities access. And so now this is what we have as the result. Next. So, just to repeat, is how those formal channels of capital have been so organized to, what the term I use here, erase and distort, right? Black participation, and to suppress and contract our wealth enabling capacity. Next, please. So how do we do repair? And I'm going to speed up because I think my time is going. How do we repair? What does that look like? Having said all of that, how do we not fall into this despair, inaction, but actually have a path that we can begin to think about actively to change these trajectories? And so, as I said earlier, in setting up and designing the Reparations Finance Lab, I was really concerned with, it was more a conversation with myself and maybe an imaginary conversation with someone who is a skeptic about racialized harm. And I was like, so how am I going to show them that this harm is not just, coming from whatever sentiment, right? But from real data. And I have an amazing team I was just saying to Elias before the presentation, it's like, oh, it's a really nice deck. I said, not me, my team, who are really amazing. I can't say young people because who are just really versed in the tools of today. And I have an amazing data scientist who we have these weekly meetings, and some meetings are really important and some meetings we're just chatting. And I kept saying to him, David, I need to figure out how to demonstrate this harm, because I'm saying all of these things. I can give you 101, sort of examples of but how do I make it into something that's scientific, that can be replicated, that can be interrogated, and that is not just my opinion, and that's not my lived experience, and just not anecdotal. And in 2024, about 2 years ago, he came up with this, I was talking about the social determinants of health and what that shows, and, all of the census data and the World Happiness Index. And he's like, okay. So he went off and we designed this thing that we call a racial harm genome, right? Which I remember saying to him, we have so much information in so many journals and so many news articles and so many just, documentation, but there's no one place that you can pull it together that says, and in a sense, corroborate your thesis about harm. So we created what's called a racial harm genome for RFL that using large learning models, AI, so AI is not all bad, although there's a piece of which it's uncompensated, but it's a whole different conversation. Academic articles and studies, and we made sure that they were they had that academic peer review process, so they were peer reviewed, they had citations, and to look at what the moral obligation would be and mapping them against what we were beginning to discern was the corporate activities that were continuing to harm communities, because the work that we do is so focused on corporates on private capital. That was an important frame for us to look at. What is the evidence showing about how private capital activity as opposed to public sector activity, which, with the UNGS report, we spoke about federal contracting, which is public, although also private when you think about some of the big companies that get public contracts for private activity. But again, another conversation. So this genome is the base on which we have now built all of our other frameworks for the architecture of repair, harm demonstration. We also thought it was important to understand that each place is different. So we spoke, we looked at the wealth disparities globally. We looked at them in the US, we looked at the UK, we looked at Jamaica. We can also within the US. And I remember saying to him, well, when I came to America, I grew up in the Bronx, and the Bronx operated very differently than the Upper West Side, where I spent a lot of my time. And so it was very important. And I said, and I started to think about what were some of the differences. And it was everything from, the buildings were better kept, the garbage was picked up, more regular, the schools were better. And so this is not an insight that I had, but it's an insight that certainly shows up in the research, that where your place is important. We saw it with redlining. We see it today in the ways in public school, in how public education is funded. Place is a fundamental determinant of your outcome. So we wanted to make sure that we were taking that from the most macro, which is global, down to the census tract, down to your zip code, your census tract, to say, how is the harm manifesting? And so that was another set of tools we built, a racial repair tool and a social access tool to go with our racial harm genome that's really interrogating what does 6 centuries of extraction, what does that look like today? How is it showing up? So that we can then begin to have a platform and a framework for directing capital. And the final tool we have just been working on for the last year is a portfolio tool that's designed for investors and capital allocators and at the institutional level, but we're also working now on it for retail investors to screen their public and private market portfolios for racial harm, labor exploitation, and even increasingly, and certainly as we think about this faith-based moral alignment within a single dashboard. We can go into that a little bit more. Next, please. And so from analysis to instruments, so we're place-based, I spoke about that. We have actually even created a perpetual fund in theory that would deliver repair over time at the scale and at the duration. One thing that really stays with me is that if the harm has been centuries in the making, a program or a project that's 6 months, a year, 2 years is not going to be sufficient to meaningfully impact on it. We have to put our capital in these sites of harm and be prepared for them to stay at the duration that they need to actually meaningfully change the trajectory of that place, and also at the scale. Right. So this perpetual tool and framing that we use is centuries of harm, centuries of repair through capital. Next, please. So we get to what to do if it says Catholic asset owners, but this is of course applicable to any asset owner. how do you put all of this into a framework that is useful and applicable to you? And the first thing is, I think, if what I've said has been persuasive, then you need to implement a reparative capital mandate, right? Which literally means you look at your investment policy statement and ensure that it acknowledges that the institutional wealth you're stewarding and is entangled with this history of racial extraction, and then expand your fiduciary care and stewardship to include a formal commitment to repair. So you all, with that, that's the first. The second one, then it's a restructuring of capital governance, right? Remember, the subsidiarity which ask us to ensure that those communities that are being harmed and for whom we are planning repair be centered and be included. We are not doing it on their behalf. They're actually part of the repair work that's being done. It's not just asking them, do you think this is correct or right? But it's actually have them tell us what repair would look like for them. And and as I was working on this piece of it, I was minded by how much this framework also aligns with the United Nations Human Rights Framework for Reparations, which calls for, and we have gone through some of them so far, the apology, which Pope Leo has offered, right? That's the framework. The first thing is the apology and acknowledgement of harm. Then comes the compensation, restitution, repair, however that takes within the context of which the reparations is being enacted. Then there are two really important parts of it. One is a commitment to non-repetition, right? This is the UN framework. And when you think about the framework that we are speaking about here, which is invested in memory, we have to commit that not only are we looking to repair, but we will never again. And, Pope Leo speaks about this as he warns us against the new enslavement of AI. He says we must learn from the past so that we do not repeat and bring into the future those really bad practices. So within the UN framework, apologies, we have had an apology. We work out how the compensation will flow. Is it restitution? Is it direct transfers? This is what this is about. A commitment to non-repetition, which is both a personal commitment to seeking justice, but also for this capital we steward to ensure that it does not continue harm. And then the final bit, which is where governance comes in, I think, is to ensure that the harmed party has what's called satisfaction, that they are the ones who tell us that they have been healed, not our frameworks, not our measurements, not our outcomes, but the party that has been harmed will say, yes, I feel their satisfaction, and essentially we can move on without any repetition. And the final bit, I think, is to come back with investing with memory, is to ensure that memory is embedded in the analytical toolkit, right? So as we're thinking about all of the decisions that we make as stewards of capital and where to put it and how, we should, from where I sit, have that just sitting there with us. What is this memory of where this capital came from? Because if we have that memory, and we use it as a lens and as a tool, then all those other reparative frames and decisions will flow from that. Next one, please. So next steps, I think we're getting to the end. So, just engage with ourselves and with our partners and our colleagues, develop finance frameworks rooted in this memory, foster partnerships, and encourage ongoing education and dialogue, of which I hope this has been a part. And I think that's the end, right, Elias? Is that the final slide? Oh, okay. Oh, and yes, additional resources. We will share out this deck, and so we'll have those links in there. And then I'm really excited to have this conversation with David.
Thanks, Enith. That was fantastic. All right, we're doing fine on the schedule. No worries. We've actually got until the half hour. So David, please come in and give us your thoughts.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Enith. A lot to think about, and hopefully I don't hammer you guys with too much more. So obviously you started your submission with just a reflection on Magnifica Humanitas, which I think probably about half of us in the room have read.
I'm sorry, something's going on with my mic.
You
We can hear
hear
you
me?
okay.
No, it's fuzzy. Is anyone else having that problem?
No?
Oh no. Oh
Everything is
Lordy.
fine.
Let me
We
So
see if
can
I
hear
can.
you fine.
You can hear me fine. Okay. All right.
Yes.
Sorry about that.
No
no
worries.
problem. So yes, as I mentioned, anchoring this in Magnifica Humanitas, which probably many of us have read, where the Pope addresses this this central core issue to this inequality that we see in the world right now, particularly between global South and global North. And then going as far as to offer an apology for the church's role in this. So he references, and Enif references as well, the doctrine of discovery, which I thought I would touch on briefly because it's just becoming sort of common parlance, which is essentially the doctrine that allowed empire building, which said that European Western Christianized nations could go and dispossess and enslave the indigenous inhabitants of lands, from Africa to Asia, and then ultimately in the Americas. And so we see that flesh out through colonization, and then obviously the origin stories of South America and North America. As Enith mentions, a lot of this culminates from three key bulls written, two of them written by Pope Nicholas in the 15th century, Dum Diversas and Romanus Pontifex, the third one written later on in the 15th century, Inter Caetera. Now, it's important to say that either side of the 15th century, the church does speak against slavery, and so it's a bit of a mixed bag, but there's no getting away from, and I've done the homework here,
David, I am actually trying to call in. It's gotten really bad. If you could just let me in on Elias. I'm not hearing I'm so sorry about that.
No, we've got time.
So I'm calling in.
Recording in progress.
You hear me?
Yeah, we hear you. Can you hear me?
Now I'm hearing you much clearer. I'm so sorry, everyone. Okay.
Fantastic.
So I got some of what you said. If you could just recap for me, top 3 points.
Yes. So just just providing a bit of context around Magnifica Humanitas, and particularly, the 15th century and the three bulls that you referenced. I was also saying that the church has made statements against slavery, either side of that, but all of the work that I can find basically ties the doctrine of discovery puts that quite squarely on the shoulders of those three bulls, which initially gave King Alfonso of Portugal the rights to lands in, I believe, the northwestern parts of Africa. This was in the midst of sort of the back end of the wars with Muslims and Saracens. So while there is some nuance there, it's safe to say that that period and the church's position over that period is a central factor in why in basically unleashing the Western civilization on this path of colonization and slavery. I will read a short extract from Dum Diversas just to give you a sense of sort of the tone of the bull and what it deals with. So, we weighing all in singular the premises with due meditation, and noting that since we had formerly by other letters of ours granted, among other things, free and ample faculty to the aforesaid King Alfonso to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ wheresoever placed, and the kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, dominions, possessions, and all movable and immovable goods whatsoever held and possessed by them, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. and to apply and appropriate to himself and his successors the kingdoms, dukedoms, counties, principalities, dominions, possessions, and goods, and to convert them to his and their use and profit by having secured the said faculty. The said King Alfonso, or by his authority the aforesaid Infante, justly and lawfully has acquired and possessed and doth possess these islands, lands, harbors, and seas, and they do of right belong and pertain to the said King Alfonso and his successors. Okay, so also important to say that even though this starts out, obviously, starts out in the Catholic countries of the world, so to speak, actually the North American predominantly Protestant view of what was or was not permissible was also built on what sort of the legacy of the Catholic approach, or the approach that was permitted by the Pope during this period. And so again, there's a lineage there that's that's really quite heavy, and one that needs to be contended with. And I think we're just beginning to do that now. So in its paper, in my view, does a phenomenal job of recognizing the current posture of apology and regret, while also insisting that a properly Catholic understanding of confession is always accompanied by a posture of repair. And I think that balance that comes through really clearly. And when you get the opportunity to read the whole paper, you see that that's handled quite richly and quite well. And then the balance of the paper concerns itself with pointing a way forward for the church, and then the global North at large to externalize that confession. So as Jesus would say to the rich young man, if you would enter the kingdom of heaven, sell all you have and follow me. With those words, Jesus is inviting this person into introspection, lament, confession, action, and then ultimately freedom. And I think that is the journey that Edith in her paper is offering to us as well. So Protestant Christians are more likely to say things like, God is doing something, or Aslan is on the move. The Catholic in me, my knee-jerk response is to say something like, but God is always doing something. However, I can't help but feel that sometimes we need the urgency, the sense of urgency and mission that comes with phrases like God is at work. And so when we think about, being graced with one social justice-oriented Pope in Francis in the previous 14 years or so, followed by Leo XIV, who has provided some of the clearest language yet for naming historic evils, and then taking this posture of confession and repentance. And then you think about groups like the two groups represented here, the Economy of Francesco and then the Francesco Collaborative, both of which have been created with a view to catalyzing and supporting this urgent action amongst other actions. It certainly does feel like something is afoot. It certainly does feel like Aslan is moving. And so, I think I would urge all of us to think along those lines, and this is a window, this is an opening for conversations that are important to have. And I think that this paper provides some really rich context discourse, but also data that allows us to have these sorts of conversations. And then I'd also say it's clear in reading Enid's work that she herself is resolving tensions that she's held as a practicing Catholic, as a person of faith, and then as a descendant of slaves, and then someone who is working in the finance industry. That's a threefold tension that she has had to resolve while getting through this work. And that comes through as well in the paper. And I think it's beautifully held. It's a tension that we all, I think, ought to embrace and ought to enter in with her as people in the financial community as well, and as people who in different ways are inheritors of the legacy of the slave trade. Okay, so now to the our word, as I call it. So there is renewed energy around area of reparations. I'm sure that doesn't surprise anyone. I'll point to a couple of things that have sort of come across my desk in the last few months. Just yesterday, I was reading Semaphore, had a bit of an article. African leaders, I'll read this verbatim. African leaders agreed on a framework to demand reparations for the transatlantic slave trade, as well as debt relief. The agreement at a summit hosted in Ghana by President John Dramani Mahama and attended by the presidents of Liberia, Namibia, and Senegal comes on the heels of a UN declaration that the slave trade was a crime against humanity. About 12 million Africans were forcefully taken to the Americas and enslaved for labor. Calls for reparations have increased in recent years, reaching a crescendo with the UN designation in March. Though the US, UK, and a host of other countries either rejected the claim or abstained from voting on it, a document issued at the Ghana event outlined a 19-point plan that includes debt relief, return of looted artifacts, and the establishment of a global reparations fund, the BBC reported. So this is Semaphore, July 6, 2023. And then let me just read a bit of a blurb here from the Associated Press on the UN resolution that came to pass on March 25th, earlier this year. The UN General Assembly on Wednesday adopted a resolution declaring the trafficking of enslaved Africans the gravest crime against humanity and calling for reparations as a concrete step towards remedying historical wrongs. The resolution also urges the prompt and unhindered restitution of cultural items, including artworks, monuments, museum pieces, documents, and national archives, to their countries of origin without charge. The vote in the 193-member world body was 123-3 with 52 abstentions. Argentina, Israel, and the US were the 3 members voting against the resolution. The UK and all 27 members of the European Union were among those that abstained. While the United States opposes the past wrongdoing of the transatlantic slave trade and all other forms of slavery, it does not recognize a legal right to reparations for historical wrongs that were not illegal under international law at the time they occurred. Deputy U.S. Ambassador Dan Negrea said before the vote. The U.S. also strongly objects to the resolution's attempt to rank crimes against humanity in any type of hierarchy, he said. The assertion that some crimes against humanity are less severe than others objectively diminishes the suffering of countless victims and survivors of other atrocities throughout history. Associated Press, March 25th, 2026. So we'll leave that there. We won't dive into, or I won't dive into the pluses or minuses of the arguments made. What I will say is that's sort of the state of play of the secular discussions, and they're largely happening at the level of the government and of governments across the world. And I found a few things refreshing about Edith's approach to this. You know, on the sort of more secular discussion, often I find that, you know, conversations around reparations tend to take on the tone of more of a punitive posture. And sometimes highly divisive, sort of a them versus us. I've found that in listening and in reading what Ian's put forward, it's felt more like something that we can all take part in, something that you know, stems from a shared understanding of Christian fraternity, a shared understanding of concepts like repentance, justice, morality, transformation. I think when anchored in that sort of context, it takes on a completely different shape and form. I would go as far as to say this is a ledger that now we all own, as opposed to two separate ledgers and two separate balance sheets. We own the balance sheet together, and we look forward together and say, how do we start to address the deficits and move things in the right direction? I've also found that often conversations around reparations tend to be anchored around sort of one-time transfers. They're, you know, based around lump sum payments and what have you. But again, I'm sure you'll agree, this is a much more systemic view of what can be done in the space of reparations. And importantly, it's not limited to governments. It allows for any asset manager of any size to take a reparative lens to how they invest and how they analyze their return, even if it's an already impact focused asset manager. So a few points worth highlighting for me, and then we'll close this up and then move to questions. Really appreciated, Edith, your ability to pull in those 3 core concepts of Catholic social teaching, being the common good, preferential option, and preferential option for the poor, and subsidiarity. I think if we pull on those threads hard enough as asset managers, it's hard to not land at the conclusion that a reparative view, a reparative lens has to form a part of how we do impact investing. And so I appreciate that anchoring. The numbers that you shared, eye-watering, obviously, but were a reminder of how, not only does wealth compound, but actually disadvantage, harm, marginalization, economic or otherwise, also compounds as well. So what you have are two exponential graphs going in the opposite direction. And that's when we look at the gaps that we see now, that's what's going on. And so those numbers do make sense. The reparations finance lab, we're still learning about that. And thank you for giving us a snapshot of your capacity and your capabilities. I think it potentially, I can't claim to know all of what's going on in this space, but potentially I think it has got the potential to be a leap forward in this space because it's important to provide objective database measures, which I think to this point, a lot of the work done has been anecdotal, important, but to actually be able to put numbers to this, to actually be able to narrow down on certain geographies and say this is where the harm has been the most concentrated, and then to formalize plans and seek outcomes to move things in another direction. I don't think that I've seen anything that's actually been anchored in data or an attempt to found this on data. So really interested to see where the lab goes, really interested to see what a community like this can bring into that lab. And so we'll be following that with interest, as you know. And it moves beyond awareness and activism. We now have the data again to ask important questions, and then finally to actually answer those important questions with at least some level of objectivity. And then I think that then places a higher moral obligation on us because now there is actually data. So I thought a few potential questions that those of us in the room might ask ourselves, not now, but just in our quiet moments. Do you agree with the argument that our economies are structurally disordered, and are there significant racial aspects to this disorder? Because that's effectively the core argument being made. And then this is uncomfortable, but discomfort is not necessarily a bad thing. And so really to start to spend time naming what resonates about what is presented, and then what may not resonate or what causes discomfort, and to really do that work of introspection at the personal level. And then again, for those of us that are asset managers or working in financial institutions, to then open that question up to kind of say, okay, what process might we as an organization have to go through over the next 6 to 12 months to really interrogate what it would look like to bring then a reparative lens to our investment practice. So just a few takeaways potentially. And with that said, I would say a big thank you to you again, Enith and Elias, passing it on to you.
David, that was very helpful, very good. Enith, did you want to respond to David before we go into any other questions or comments?
I just want to say thank him for reading the paper, and I'm actually waiting for him for his comments. He is a professor of economics, so I'm very, I'm still a student, so I wanted to have his comments, but thank you for those. And I think so much of, a couple of things resonated. The last bit that asked us to sit with what has been presented, to interrogate it through our own lens, and to understand that there will be discomfort, right? Because at the end of the day, what I've laid out is a harm that we have all been inheritors of, different sides of the ledger, but we have all been part of that history. And it is discomforting to be someone who works in capital. I worked, every one of us who have ever worked in formal banking and, Wall Street can probably attest to our just absolute both awe and dismay at just how much capital flows, and just how brutal the acquisition of it is. So that's a confession, but also just how much of it there is. And to sit with that and having participated in that, and then to also sit with and I speak often about, the storytelling, the narrative, and what does it mean to be a child who was born, few miles from where my family was enslaved, right? And to grow up in a country that was wrestling with not just post-colonial realities, but also independent realities, right? The independence of being a nation that now had sort of graduated, and we were to take care of ourselves because we got to elect a prime minister, we got to elect our representatives. It was no longer, coming from crown rule, but actually an interesting fact about much of the Caribbean is that while others have gone the Republic route, we still have King Charles as our head of state. Don't ask me. Just move right along, right? And so that is a tension that one reckons with. And then the final one is how to bring a conversation about repair that is both factual and obligatory, because it's one of those things. If you have new information, then I think there's an obligation to act on it, right? And so it may be confrontational, could be, but it's also there's an obligation that flows from it, because once the phrase is, once you know better, you do better, right? So now that we know different, and I hope better, what do we do with that? And so those are some of the things that jumped out at me. What it is that the faith asks. We are asked to confess our sins. We're asked to repent from our sins, and then we're also asked to do acts of penitence, right, to repair. And here we have it. And for those of us who steward capital and who are responsible for deploying capital, and who in our own way make up the trillions of dollars that flows through this world, each decision we make can actually have an impact. And how do we hold that as something that we have, and that we can then begin to shift the conversation? I remember I said earlier in the presentation that ESG shifted the conversation about what your capital can do, the obligation of your capital. And I'm hoping this frame about repair has a similar shift about your capital. And I do see a hand.
Yes, that's Rodleen, who has a good comment. Speaking of putting memory back in our analysis, a comment on history of Haiti, if you're not familiar with that. Rodleen?
Yes, thank you. I love the work that you I love the work that you did, the research you're just giving us, because if we want to solve today and the future for our children, the next generation, we need to go dig in the past and see what the seed that was planted, that evil seed, and how to pull it out. So I just gave you that information. It's not by accident. For example, Haiti is the first country that gained their freedom. And if you look at the Latin America, a lot of the flag have red in them and blue. Haiti helped to repair that. As a result, they really put a chokehold on Haiti. So when you see in the news, what you're seeing in the news, it's not that. Haiti fought England and won, came in the U.S. and fight on for the U.S. against England, I believe, and fought the French, fought the Spain, and won all the time. And they're like, okay, they gave it a name. I don't want to say it. We cannot let them thrive. So everything you're seeing in the news, it's not by accident. It's designed. When the white colon they came to New Orleans or go back to France, what they did, their children, the 25,000 people say, this land belonged to me. It was my dad. So they sent the people in the mountain. So now when you send someone in the mountain for 200 years, no education, nothing to survive, this is what you see today. It took 60 years for the world to recognize Haiti as a country until the Pope mandated that. So it's a lot of work against the global South, and we need to do research and learn, and then people that are in the position that can do better, they can help to repair it a bit at a time, I believe. Thank you for inviting me.
Sure. Thank you, Eileen. Yes. Anybody else have a question or a comment? Raise your hand. Yes, Graham?
Thanks, Enith. Thoroughly enjoyed that. And it's helped me catch up since we last spoke a few months ago. So
Yes.
really appreciated that. 2 points that might be useful to everyone, and I'm not sure. I know I've talked about the one big point with you, and we have more conversations we will have.
Yeah.
So what I really loved was where you talked at the beginning about the importance for systemic analysis. And David, what you said towards the end bracketed that when you said that wealth and harm compounds. So I'll come to that in a minute, but to make sure I don't forget my other point, for people who are not familiar with it, there's an organization or a movement started recently by a financial advisor, George Kinder, and it's called Fiat, which stands for Fiduciary in All Things. And it's about really expanding the entire concept of fiduciarity across all capitals, all things. And I thought that might be a very useful website for people to take a look at and to perhaps connect with George. If anybody wants me to introduce you to George, drop me an email and I'm more than happy to do that. And by the way, Elias, he's a really good speaker, so he would fit perfectly into here
Very
at
good.
some point.
Very good. All right. Thank you, Graham.
The big thing I want to mention, though, is, from systemic analysis, as you and I have discussed, Enith, there's the central question of why does money flow the way it does, which you pointed at. And what you said, David, wealth and harm compounds. And as you and I have discussed, Enith, there's something deep inside economic theory, and that economists simplified away. One of the economists of about sort of 50 odd years ago said, we have to take as axiomatic that we can use these simplified statistics, because if we, it was Samuelson, by the way, who said that if we don't take it as axiomatic, then we can't make economics as a science.
Yeah.
But one of the consequences of that is that we've built an economy as if those simplifications accurately describe how the world works. And one of the consequences of that is that economics is blind to the actual underlying reason why things like tithing are vital. There are very few ecosystems of companies that have a tithing mechanism between the companies where they share profit with each other in order to maintain the health of the ecosystem. The one big one that does have tithing between companies, not just tithing between people, but tithing between companies, is, no surprise here, the cooperative conglomerate
Yes.
started by a Catholic priest in the Basque region based on the Catholic social teachings called Mondragon.
Right.
And the companies in Mondragon have to put a minimum of 14%, 14%, into a common pooling mechanism, and some put up to 40%, 40. And over the past decade, it's become really clear that tithing company to company has been a key reason for Mondragon's success. So this is something we can dive into, and perhaps this, if it's helpful, this may be something that in a future conversation we really look at, have a multi-way conversation. What does each of us see as, systemic causes of why money flows the way it does, and come to some deeper understanding than any of us has at the moment.
And of
Very good.
course, Graham, the notion of asset owners tithing for a reparative fund, that just makes my heart happy.
Very good. Very good. Other thoughts? I have a quick one I'd like to drop in. Among the several wonderful points I thought you made, Enith, this point again about putting memory back into the analysis. What I thought of is the fact that back in the early 1970s, as I understand it, as neoliberal theories around the economy were taking hold with Milton Friedman and all that, the economists gradually got together and said, why are we even teaching economic history? We're a science,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
We'll just get rid of that history. We don't need to remember anything. And that's an externality, right? So it's wonderful that you're pointing exactly to the need to re-embed that, which other, models of the economy are much better at doing. So I think, that's part of a greater realization that whatever economics is, it's not a real science, and it is also incredibly blind, just as you and Graham were saying. So love that point.
And of
Other
course,
thought?
science builds on science, right?
Yeah.
Whether you're a physicist or a biologist or a chemist, you have to first principles always, right? So that's even nonsense, right?
That's
Just
right.
that whole, yeah.
Anyone else? Let's see. Yeah, note in the chat from Graham again. Yeah. So there's a whole theoretical conversation here, which this should be a part of. I'll throw in one other kind of personal thing. I think that just from my more informal understanding of all this, there was a misunderstanding about what reparations even was. And something that you're getting at, Enith, and David mentioned too, is a way of understanding that this process, as we are discussing it, there's a word that I like, which is regeneration. So we're sort of moving toward accomplishing several things at the same time, maybe some easier than others, but the idea of moving, sums of money at this scale would be transformative, which is a word that I like because I know people, for example, working in restorative justice. And a woman said to me recently, we're trying to get beyond even just restorative. We want the work we're doing to be transformative. It's not just for those people who've been harmed, it's for the entire community. So I think that's a beautiful way of looking at it. And I think, this process in a way could be something that's more like transformative and regenerative, which would be very powerful also.
Thank you for bringing that up because, within the sort of reparations movement, and I'm not speaking for them, but what I take away is there's a clear through line, which essentially can be broken down into when Black people are free and healed, the whole planet is free and healed because we hold in our bodies and in our lived experience the contemporary history of man's inhumanity to man. Yeah. Right? And so if we think about freeing the world from the scourge of hate and prejudice and extraction and exploitation, it is in Black lives and Black communities and Black bodies that it is most exemplified, right? For such a long time. And so if going back to first principles, if we get right with Black folk, Good. Uh, um, then that is transformative. If we
Yeah.
stop writing laws and enacting policies and stop making private investment decisions that are designed to extract from or exclude Black people, guess what? Everyone does better. Because the truth is, and we see it so clearly with what's going on currently. I don't know what's in the hearts of people who are making decisions around things like the Big Beautiful Bill and Project 2025 and Doge, but I do know that those harms have fallen disproportionately on the Black community. It has fallen on us in employment because, as fraught as it is, and despite all of the data that I showed, the federal government, in fact, state government, is one of the few places where, because actually they're equity based, you take a test, you pass. It's actually a place that Black people have been able to find employment. It's not that it's a jobs program for Black folks why Black people are in the federal government. It's because, guess what? It's not a good old boy or good old girl network, right? They're transparent. Qualifications and assessment, and you take your tests and you pass and you get a position, right? Doesn't pay well as being out in the private sector, but at least you're in a way in which you're then protected and your advancement is not dependent on favors. So what has happened since the last election is that that dismantling, which I'm not saying it was targeted, but it has fallen disproportionately on Black folk. And this ARMS report that I speak about in the paper really goes into the ways in which there seems to have been a very systematic attempt to box in and dislodge Black folk from the economic wellness of America, including things like, why can't, when you look at what has happened to the Affordable Care Act, right? Again, not passing judgment, but I'm sure each one has their own view. But when Black folk are not afforded expanded Medicaid, so are poor white people.
Right.
And so are poor other communities, right? And so, this notion of you can sort of, in a very surgical way, cut and edit Black folk out of the economic life and know that they will be harmed is nonsense. So if we expand Medicaid so that all people who need health care don't have to barter with their lives and their life savings and their lifestyle, everyone will have that as a facility. If we fund education, not based on your property taxes, which we know historically means that Black schools are underfunded. Productivity in the economy rises. We all do better, right? So, that's the frame. If get right with Black folk and America we will have such a outpouring of well-being and productivity and health and joy, right? One of the next tool we're launching is called the Black Happiness Index, which is really looking at, in addition to telling the pain and the trauma, is looking forward and saying, how do we know that that we are achieving goals, and how are we measuring accomplishment, and how are telling ourselves a different story? And so this index that we're very busy pulling together is looking at how do we feel, what is our experience with safety and belonging, with economic advancement, right? With inclusion, with civic participation. And the final and the most important one for me is how are we doing with joy, possibility, and well-being? We can measure those, right? And if Black folk are having it, trust and believe, we have a healthier nation, right? So, yeah.
That's good. That's good. I'm going to give Rick the final question.
Thank you very much for a very, very enlightening discussion and presentation. I worked for about 30 years in the finance industry, and one of the first things you learn in in finance is that the golden rule of the power of compounding, right? And when it dawned on me, that in this country in particular, but in most countries, in many, if not most countries around the world, um, the original wealth was created on the backs of people, enslaved people, and people who were providing their labor for zero or next to nothing, and then thinking about that from a kind of a mathematical perspective over the centuries, the compounding of all that free wealth, that free labor. It was just that for me was just the epiphany and the aha moment. So yeah. So your attempt at quantifying that and at providing a framework for thinking about that is super helpful to me. Thank you for that. I was thinking about another framework as well that I'd be curious. I don't think we have time to talk about it, but I remember hearing somebody give a talk about finance and about our system here in the US, but many systems I think around the world. And the framework was super interesting, which was, the governance framework. And so in the US, and according to this view, we have two systems that exist in tension with each other. We have a capitalist system and we have a democratic system of governance. And they are in tension with each other because the democratic system, if you really think about democracy, it's one person, one vote, right? That's ultimately what it boils down to. Whereas in capitalism, in a capitalist system of governance, you can have, one person with 100 votes, with many more than just one
With all
vote.
the votes.
Yeah, and so you have this tension, right? At least in the U.S. with these two coexisting systems of democracy and capitalism. And the way that we historically have reconciled that is through the function of the regulator, right? The regulatory function, kind of in the middle. So when it gets too out of whack, when the system gets too far in one direction versus the other, that the regulator traditionally or historically has played that role of bringing things back into balance. I would say we're totally out of whack now, where these tech companies, the owners of these tech companies have just extraordinary concentrations of ownership and power right now. But anyway, that framework is one that has always really resonated with me and felt, really true in many senses. And I'm curious to how you would react to that idea and integrating that into kind of what you're doing in your own work and your framework.
Edith, can you make it quick? We have to drop off in just a second.
Yeah,
We're at time.
wow, that's a deep political economy question. I would
Yeah.
say that with all of its imperfections, the promise of democracy, which we have not fully realized, certainly in this country, is one that is most in keeping, frankly, with our Catholic social teachings, right? Because it centers humanity, it centers and defends each individual's right to a good life, right? And it actually is in tension with capital to the extent that capitalism and capitalist systems separate each person from their fulfillment of their best and ultimate life, right? So there's that piece of that. So I would say there are many, many different ways that humans have decided to organize themselves politically, but in a sort of evaluation of good, bad, indifferent, not so good, tensions, that's all. I would say democracy still is the more attractive one, simply because it recognizes or seeks to recognize the inalienable rights of all human beings to conscience, to freedom, to their own pursuits. Capitalism is a whole nother ball of wax as a way of distributing resources, right? Our collective resources. You know, we heard about the cooperative. That's capitalism as well, right? That's folks deciding to unite for the common good, right?
Mhm.
And to share their wealth. That's a capitalist model, right? Because it's ultimately dealing with excess, right? At the heart of, you know, capitalism, capital, the economy is how do you generate and distribute excess so that all members of your society have access to what they want. So it is, again, capitalism is, there's a lot wrong with it, but we haven't come up with a different, more efficient system to distribute resources. What we have had are exactly what you just spoke about. The blocks in capital where one person kind of sits. You know, I was having a discussion the other day. You know, and I said, you know, you have these folks who are like a blockage in the artery of capital, right? Because if capital would flow, it's like your blood. It kind of goes through and it does really good things. Takes out the bad stuff, bring in, you know, good oxidized blood so that you can run and you can do all of the things. But when one thing sits in, you get a stroke, you get a heart attack. And we now have trillionaires who are choking the system, literally killing the system, right?
True.
So I don't know if that's an answer, but it's just a frame that I think about. So democracy, we haven't come up with a better system, and it's better than much of the alternative because it centers the individual and their rights and their ability to and the promise of them being able to live for themselves a life that they determine is best for them. Capitalism, because it promises distribution of resources so that all are able to participate in what we jointly produce.
And
Now we get into all of the delineations.
let's hope we're also making progress on the economic model, as I think
Yes.
everybody saw here today. I have to
Yes.
jump to another meeting I'm supposed to be in charge of. Thank you all for a great
Thank you
conversation,
for
Enith
staying.
and David and everybody. The chat was wonderful. Save the chat. And there'll be a follow-up about Enith's working paper, which we'll reach out to about as well.
Thank you
Thank you
all
all.
so much.
Blessings. Great to be with you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.